I want us to look at some more tidbits that we see in Matthew's gospel that we get introduced to in chapter 1 and 2, because these will get repeated to some degree through the rest of his gospel. And the tidbit is what we already see with Matthew, and I'll show you some of these texts, where Matthew is basically saying, and this was fulfilled. This was according to what the prophets wrote, as the prophets said. And take a look at these. Now, it's obvious that Matthew wants his readers to see that what God had earlier said through the prophets in the Old Testament prophets and in the law, the Torah, that God is very active and alive in Jesus. In fact, over 40 times in his gospel, Matthew is going to give us that indication that Jesus is doing something, Jesus is saying something, other people are reacting to Jesus in such a way that the prophets of the Old Testament, who had lived hundreds of years prior to Jesus, had referred to, had predicted, had said this was going to happen. Now, some of these are very specific to Jesus. In fact, if you'd go back to these Old Testament prophets, you would see that it's very specific to someone like Jesus, and therefore we understand that Jesus is this Christ. He is the Messiah. He is God's King. He is God's Son. But many of these are a little more general in the Old Testament context. And then we can see that Jesus is the exemplary example of this, what the prophets had talked about, happening. For example, the virgin birth that's in chapter 1. And Matthew will refer to the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. If you read that, you can see it's in reference to an event that happened during King Ahaz, where the prophet Isaiah is trying to provide hope to Ahaz and the people of Jerusalem. There's going to be a child born of a young woman, and when that happens, you know God is with us. That certainly happened during Ahaz's time. And yet Matthew wants us to note, and he uses the Greek translation, which uses the word virgin for this, that we see something similar to that with Jesus, that Jesus is born of a virgin, of this young woman, and that he's the sign that God is with us. Now again, for somebody who doesn't believe, we may poo-poo that, but I would just say don't panic, because that's not who Matthew is really aiming at. He's aiming these comments to those of us who are paying attention, who realize that God is alive and well through Scripture and in our everyday lives. Another case in point is in chapter 2, verse 23, where he indicates that the prophets had indicated that Jesus would be called a Nazarene. We don't have a specific prophet or a text that says that. In fact, if you go and look at what the scholars have to say, they disagree as to what Matthew's trying to get across. Is he referring to a place like Nazareth? And those folks who hold that position are going to go tracing into root words. Other folks will say this is an indication of shame. As we get in the Gospel of John, what good comes out of Nazareth? And so that Jesus is identified with shame and humility. That there's something about him that most folks would overlook, according to Isaiah 53. Obviously, what Matthew's trying to get us to see is every little wrinkle, every little detail where God is at work. And let me give you an illustration. Here we are in the midst of the COVID-19 virus. And it's new to us, but if you would go back and read and see the photographs of the Spanish flu of 1918 and the years that followed, you would see there's a lot of similarities in how people reacted. They even have pictures of people wearing bandanas over their mouth, and the whole procedure. There are parallels. Not that what we're dealing with is an exact replica, but people are people, and we tend to react to certain events and certain viruses and things outside of our control in very similar ways. You can look at the Spanish flu and see the reactions, the panic, the misinformation, and guess what? Here we are 102 years later, and while we are technically far advanced, we're the same type of people. And Matthew's going to let us see that whenever he brings this kind of stuff out. What happens to Jesus often had happened earlier with the prophets. What happened in the reaction to Jesus had happened earlier with the prophets. And so while the people of Israel may look at themselves as being far more advanced, Matthew is saying, no, this is repeated, and it is repeated in a much more noticeable way with Jesus than what it has happened in the past.